Hello, everybody. Good afternoon for our viewers and listeners. My pleasure to open this roundtable about Brazil and United States diplomatic relationship and its main defies. UT Lila's Brazil Center utmost mission is to promote interest in Brazilian studies on 40 acres, and this afternoon of debate fits into that primordial goal. For those who do not know Brazilian history very well, today, November 15th, is the Brazilian Republic Day, founded on the same day 130 years ago, 34 years ago. It was a very contradictory range of time, containing some hope, but also a lot of deceptions and contradictions. And this afternoon, I have the big honor of introducing each of you of our panelists today. Brian Winter is a UT alumni and one of the editor-in-chief of American Quarterly and a seasoned analyst of Latin American politics. He served as a correspondent for Reuters before taking on his current role in New York, where he is also the vice president of policy for the American Society and Council of the Americas. He has been called the best foreign expert on Brazil of this moment by Global News. Brian is the author of several books, including The Accidental President of Brazil, co-author with the former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Wendy Winter, you have the big honor to have her here, professor in the UT Department of Government Studies, Comparative Politics, with an emphasis on Latin American affairs. She has done in-depth work on the military in Brazil and South American CON, and well as research on social policy issues in Latin America, with special attention to the politics of education and health reform. She has also published a book on the Worker Party of Brazil. Kurt Weyland, another UT scholar, you have the big privilege to have him here, is the Mike Hogg Professor in Liberal Arts and Government at the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include democratization and authoritarian rules, social policy and policy diffusion, and populism in Latin America and Europe. She has done extensive field research in Brazil as well as in several Latin American countries. And finally, the one who's be coordinating this session, this afternoon roundtable, is my dear friend, Rosental Alves, is a professor of journalism and the director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas. He served as the managing editor and member of the board of directors of the Jornal do Brasil. On behalf of Brazil Center, thanks for your time and your service, and I'm sure you have a memorable afternoon of debates. Rosental, I'm giving you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcelo. Muito obrigado. It's really a pleasure to participate in this roundtable. I will remember my times as a correspondent for Jornal do Brasil, that I was following the Brazil-United States relations closer than I do now. But I think we can start with Brian to set up the discussion here, and then we follow after that, because he has been following very closely that. So Brian, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Well, boa tarde. From Sao Paulo, by the way. I'm based in New York these days, but I've been in Brazil for the last 2 weeks. It was 98 degrees here today, which is very, for somebody who went to school in Austin like I did, not the end of the world, but I lived here for 5 years, back in the 2010s, and it was never this hot. So, unfortunately, another sign perhaps of a changing planet. I want to say just first how much of an honor it is to be back speaking to my old alma mater and in such good company with Wendy and Kurt and Marcelo and Rosental. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just going to make some brief initial remarks, maybe 5 minutes, maybe a bit more. The topic today is U.S. and Brazil relations in the 21st century. And based on kind of my contacts in Washington and Brasilia, I want to try to give both perspectives here. Let me start with Washington and talk about how Washington sees Brazil right now. And if I was to choose one word, it would be relief. Relief that democracy survived the challenges in Brazil that it faced in 2022, accentuated by the fact that, the perception that we went through something similar in the United States. And, just as in the months after the 2020 election, we found out things about just how grave this risk to institutions had been, we have learned similar things about what happened what was happening a year ago in Brazil. We now know that former President Bolsonaro sounded out some of the military leadership about the possibility of overturning the election. We now know that senior commanders within the military threatened civilian members of the Supreme Court with potentially, sort of unspecified consequences unless they agreed to switch Brazil to a paper ballot system. And then, of course, we all saw what happened on January 8th, 2023, when an insurrection that was in some ways worse than what we'd seen 2 years previously in the United States, keeping in mind that all three government buildings representing the three branches of power in Brazil were invaded by rioters and sacked. I think that now, I think we're still in that phase, to be honest with you. It's been almost a year, but I think there's an awareness of just how big the challenge to democracy was, and a relief that in some ways, at least from an institutional perspective, a lot of things in Brazil seem back to normal. There have been disagreements with the Lula government between him and the Biden administration, but I think there's also a clear realization that on big issues like climate change and democracy, that Brazil can be a positive partner. On the climate change front, I think that everyone, including myself, has been surprised by how quickly deforestation has fallen in the Amazon, more than 40% on a year-on-year basis. Many of us thought that would take potentially years for them to turn around, given kind of the politics behind that, but it's happened very quickly. And I think, there's an appreciation for Brazil's stability in a region right now, referring to Latin America, that's full of trouble spots. Lula has solid popularity, somewhere between 50 and 60% in most polls. That may not sound great, but for those of us who follow the region as a whole, both in the United States and in Latin America, most presidents are in the 30s or lower these days. So 55 to 60 is actually, it's not bad. The economy might grow 3% this year. We're nearing the end of the year. Things are going well, in part because it was a great harvest. And I joked the other day that Brazilian newspapers have become boring. And I think there's some truth to that. There's kind of usual policy debates and things happening, and questions over relationship with Congress and kind of other things. But for the most part, it's been quiet. In turning to the relationship between Biden and Lula themselves, there is good chemistry between the two leaders. They've met a couple of times. They've really connected over their shared history in organized labor, in labor unions. There's a real respect between the two of them. I recently wrote for Piauí magazine, which is sort of Brazil's answer to the New Yorker, that Joe Biden is probably the most petista president that the United States has had for the last 50, 60 years. For those who are not specialists, petista means PT, which of course is Lula's party. There's also an understanding in the Biden administration that Brazil is going to have a positive relationship with China, that there is some ideological affinity there, and I've certainly heard that firsthand, but that it's a commercial relationship that's very important, that it's not productive for leaders in Washington to kind of wag their fingers at people in Brasilia and say, hey, you shouldn't really be dealing with them, because it's not, the commercial part of it is not particularly ideological. For Brazil, China is the biggest trading partner. And, despite the efforts of people like Florida Senator Marco Rubio to portray this as kind of a left-right issue in Latin America, it's simply not. Governments on left, right, and center have all sought positive relations with China. They've all made state visits. Some of the most enthusiastic proponents of Chinese investment and trade over the last couple of years in the region have been people like Mauricio Macri, Guillermo Lasso, Ivan Duque, and others. And of course, the leaders that I've named are all recent leaders on either the center right or right. Sebastián Piñera is another example of all these people that I just named made state visits to China while they were in office. So this is really not a left-right issue. and the Biden administration knows that. One other little detail, the U.S. administration, the Biden administration has made an effort to, as you do in diplomacy, to try to say things that are both true and will agradar, that will please the person who you're speaking to. And when they met in February, Biden made a point of telling Lula that he sees Brazil not as a regional power, but a global power. And that was something that was very important to Brazilian ears. That said, there have been clear points of conflict, and the biggest one has been Lula's rhetoric on the war in Ukraine, in which Lula said, both prior to taking office and once he was in office, that Putin and Zelensky have equal portions of fault for that war. He also said, while in China earlier this year, Lula said that the U.S. and European arms sales to Ukraine were responsible, above all, sobre tudo, for the continuation of the war. That did not go over at all well in Washington. And I think that there's been a realization that on some of these issues, maybe Brazil is more of a partner than an ally, which is worth thinking about a little bit. But that's, a partner on issues like climate change, as opposed to an ally with, with shared values who you can at least, no one expects automatic alignment, of course, but there was a hope, particularly given the contrast with Bolsonaro, that Lula was going to be more of kind of a voice for democracy in the world. That has not really been the case, especially in the sort of final part of this, this holy trinity, if you will, of things that upset the Biden administration a bit, was earlier this year when Lula received the Venezuelan dictator, Nicolas Maduro, for, what not only a visit to the presidential palace in Brasilia, but what really had the pageantry almost of a state visit, and then stood next to him on stage and said that Venezuela's only real, he didn't say his only problem, but he said that the problem in Venezuela was a problem of narrative as opposed to a problem of reality. And that was something that raised some eyebrows. The latest flashpoint, just kind of getting to the end here, the latest flashpoint, of course, has been the war in the Middle East. And so far, I think there's a perception that Lula's words on this have been more calibrated. This was in part because Brazil was presiding over the UN Security Council as part of its rotating chair during the month of October. It really seemed like he and the Brazilian government as a whole were choosing their words and images with great care, always pushing for peace, but saying, for example, that Hamas had led a terrorist attack, which Lula condemned. In more recent days, and I've been actually doing research for a book these last couple of days, so I've not been as fully plugged in as I normally would. He did compare, on kind of an apples to apples basis, the terrorism of Hamas with the bombardment that the Israeli government is effecting in Gaza. And so that, on the one hand, raised some eyebrows, but it's also rhetoric that is consistent with what we're seeing elsewhere in the global South, as well as, of course, in some places in Europe and in the United States. So I'm not sure. I think Lula's statements on that front have been more in the mainstream. So that's basically it. I think it's a relationship that has had its ups and downs. Certainly points of conflict, disappointment in a way that Lula has not turned out to be somebody who Biden can count on as a global promoter of democracy and Western values, but also a realization that he has been able to see off that challenge to Brazilian democracy and create a certain stability in a region that, like I said, has a lot of other trouble spots. So with that, Rosental, back to you. You're on mute, though.
I think this was a great summary. I think that the latest talk about Hamas and Israel, comparing the two, was a little out of the mainstream, even in Europe and in the United States, a little bit beyond the concern, the legitimate concern about the bombardments, etc. But you're right. I mean, and I think you touched all the main points. I don't think you left any out. But let's see what Wendy talks now and how she reacts to that, and then we go to Kurt.
So I want to start by going back to Bolsonaro. So all populists need an enemy. They stay in they get in business and they stay in business because of enemies. So what you really saw under Bolsonaro was the demonization of cosmopolitanism and environmentalism, and Greta Thunberg seemed like the biggest enemy in the world. So I agree with Brian that under Lula, while he may side with the Russia a little bit more than the Biden administration wants, we don't have the sort of sound and fury that you had under Bolsonaro. So that is very relieving. I want to mention one point that hasn't fully come out and one point that hasn't come out at all, and that is the role of agribusiness in Brazil, that I think will disrupt the idea that Brazil and the Western powers can have a sustained and positive relationship on deforestation. Yes, indeed, deforestation has come way down under Lula, the second Lula, third Lula government. However, the draw of China is really something. The French supermarkets can say, we're not going to import rainforest beef. But the fact of the matter is agribusiness is an increasing part of the Brazilian economy. Industry is down as a percentage of the Brazilian economy. There's an internal migration going not to the Amazon per se, but to Mato Grosso and the Center West. And this is turning, they call it the Savannahization of that region. And so I think this is quite concerning. It's environmentally terrible. There's a lot of money to be made from it. And part of it is internal politics. The governors of these states are strong. They voted overwhelmingly for Bolsonaro. There's a lot of money to be made. There's a migration there. And this comes right down to exports. So it's environmentally hazardous. A lot of people live in cities. We can talk about, preserving the rainforest, but these people have to live, and they're, creating tire shops and restaurants and everything around this sort of soy economy. And so that's very important. And again, you have to look at the internal politics. And this takes away a little bit or diminishes the kind of relationship you see in the news, like, okay, now Brazil is preserving the Amazon and, it's on better terms with the United States because of it. There's a second layer story here that I think is important and concerning, and it's exports to China, internal politics in Brazil, an internal migration, and the declining industry. Brazilian agribusiness will become more important. It's becoming more important with the war in Ukraine. So this is a global food chain that's really important. And the imports from China are the other side of this relationship. Another point I wanted to mention that I don't think it has come up, and it's just hitting the news now. Brazil has an increasing problem with narco trafficking and the violence around it. Lula signed off last week on having the military go into ports and favelas. And what you're starting to see is U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, U.S. military operations get involved with the drug trafficking issue. And if someone like Lula, who historically was not in favor of the military in domestic politics or domestic even drug trafficking, is starting to sign off on this, that's another point I think that you're going to see in US-Brazil relations to keep your eye on. So I'll turn it over.
Great. I think those 2 points are fantastic. The first one that I want to just before I pass to Kurt, I think the agribusiness, you're right on mark on that. But I think the agribusiness in Brazil doesn't need more territory and will be dramatically affected by deforestation. So I think it may be in a moment here that the agribusiness has a chance to reconcile even with Lula, and although they are in separate terrains, but the productivity of Brazil beef is lower than other parts of the world. So there is a chance of growth there that maybe help to pacify that. But I think you're totally right on this point on calling this attention. Kurt, is your turn.
Good, thank you. So, Brian, I agree that in the US, the relief over Lula defeating Bolsonaro is very important, and that Brazilian democracy survived. In some sense, however, in light of the threat that Brazil faced, I find it particularly disappointing that Lula isn't more committed to and more coherent about democracy. You know, like the big stage that he gave for Maduro's readmission to the regional community and criticizing US sanctions. I mean, when you think, you know, Lula suffered repression under an authoritarian regime, and for him not to side with the victims of authoritarianism I find it personally very disappointing, and I'm sure Washington is like, what's wrong with you? I think a more consistent position, I think, would improve the relationship. Similar with Ukraine. I mean, Latin American countries and Brazil has long been very big into non-intervention, right? I mean, so the Ukraine is like the most massive, brutal, armed intervention that we've seen in a long time. And so for Brazil not to come out and say, you know, the same way that we don't want the United States to trample over Latin America, we don't want to have Russia trample over its neighbors, I find it personally disappointing. And I'm sure Washington is like, you know, once again, what's wrong with you? And so I think there are 2 points here which to kind of understand what's going on, first in Brazil and second in Washington. In Brazil, what you see is a common tendency, especially of left-wing presidents in Latin America, who are domestically fairly constrained by business pressures, domestic and international, by domestic elites, by conservative parties. So clearly Latin American presidents use the greater independence and autonomy they have on the foreign front to kind of signal that they're still, you know, they pull the more left-wing card in foreign policy. It's easier to do, it's cheaper to do, you get some heat, but it's not nearly the same as if you push like serious leftist policies domestically. And so you have kind of a, you know, how should I say that, sort of compensatory effect. You know, Lula, like other left-wingers in Latin America, I'm domestically constrained, but that makes me signal more that, you know, yes, I'm still a friend of the left in Latin America, and my amigo Maduro can come, and all these kinds of things. Now, I think in Washington, I think that's probably seen as an irritant rather than a real problem, simply because Brazil is not yet all that powerful and all that important. I mean, I think what you see with Lula, I think Lula has in some sense not quite been aware that Brazil's position nowadays is less than Brazil's position was in 2008 and 2010, when Brazil seemed to be on the ascendant and the regional power. And, you know, he had a lot of legitimacy because domestically he was bringing down poverty and inequality and all these kinds of things. In Brazil now, I mean, Lula doesn't have that performance to look back on. Brazil is not really on the ascendant in the same way. And so I think Washington can kind of live with some of those irritants simply because, Brazil doesn't seem to be as moving forward, claiming regional leadership as Lula could do during his first longer stint as president. And I think that's important to highlight as a background factor, that I I think Lula clearly overestimates Brazil's global role and importance and engages in some of these initiatives, maybe I'll have to mediate in the Ukraine-Russia war. Yeah, try. So that's I think, a sort of background factor that is important to.
Okay. Let me give you my quick reaction. I think that the thing of the left. I mean, and my question to Brian would be this: if he thinks that Lula is more leftist now than he was in the previous two moments, but in the case of Ukraine, we thought, because we as a country have always had this aspiration. We were outraged that we were not part of the Security Council after the creation of the Security Council. It was a disappointment. We thought that we should be there and that we should have received much more from the United States than we received for our engagement in the World War II, etc. But in the Ukraine thing, in the beginning I thought, oh wow, he really believes that he will be the mediator. He's going to have the Nobel Prize for resolving the problem. So he's trying to be neutral there. But then he starts saying other things that were totally, nuts. But the thing of Latin American context, I'm not even that concerned about Maduro, because I think that Maduro, he really, I think he is well positioned to play a role there. But I was disappointed with Nicaragua. I mean, Nicaragua is a bloody horrible dictatorship that is not related to left or to right. It's a crazy, dramatic thing. And even in the debate with Bolsonaro, he could not say one word against a criminal regime that has nothing to do with its origins. So my question to Brian: is Lula more leftist now than he was when he was president before?
Rosental and Brian, sorry, may I jump in? It's not. I'm not supposed to do that, but it's impossible to keep quiet while I listen to you. And so, just three brief questions that I would like to listen to you all. Okay, Rosental, Wendy, Kurt, Brian. First is about the BRICS currency, and in which way you believe that the United States, Brazil's part of that project, and in some sense, how do you believe that the United States should take that menace to dollar seriously? And so, first thing. Second is a kind of a partnership, following Brian's approach about that, in the field of the labor rights. Something that I believe that Biden found in Lula as a way to regain the American trade union support. Something that I believe that is totally unprecedented, considering the history of both countries. And I have a question for you all. And lastly, I'd like to listen to you about this deadlock, APEC deadlock. You are having this meeting now in San Francisco today, the APEC, and we see the level of tensions between United States and China. And if you believe that Latin America and Brazil could harness this moment to attract a new investment or to become a new partner, considering the long-term strategy of the United States, considering that the relationship with China deteriorated strongly recently. And if you believe that beyond Mexico and the NAFTA agreement, Latin America or in Brazil would have some space to get it to open up new opportunities, considering that those deadlocks. Sorry, I was not supposed to ask any question, but I couldn't resist. You are irresistible.
Gosh, where do you even begin? Let me try to answer Rosenthal's question. Rosenthal asked, is Lula more leftist than he used to be? You know, it's funny, I have a joke that I probably use too much, which is that, you know, the people who understand politics best these days tend to be not political analysts, but psychoanalysts. Because we spend so much time trying to figure out the way these people think and what goes on in their head in an era where, you know, maybe executive power is even more concentrated than it used to be. So as someone who's been trying to understand Lula for the better part of 20 years now, I mean, let me give you my personal, imperfect by its nature read on this, which I think it's the same Lula that it always was, which is a Lula who sees the world primarily through the lens of class struggle. And I think that makes him willing to look past the sins of people who are quote unquote on his side, or more to the point perhaps, are aligned in, you know, trying to make life better for the people. That's kind of the way I think he thinks about it, rather than a view that I would, you know, share. But I think that's the essence of it. And so he sees fellow travelers on the left who tend to have that emphasis, at least in theory, even though the results are clearly disastrous in places like Venezuela and Nicaragua as well, you know, as well as having destroyed democracies in places like that. And I think Lula essentially is willing to look past that, or is willing to say, oh, you know, in the case of Venezuela, well, yeah, it's true. No, we wish there was democracy there and things are tough, but look back at what, you know, the US supported the coup against Chavez back in 2002, and things got complicated, and yeah, Maduro got a little bit out of control. And that has echoes of, you know, the last 60 years of attempts by the Latin American left, by previous generations especially, to justify what happens in Cuba by saying that it's a product of the US embargo. I mean, there's always a narrative that people can lean on to try to justify what's happening. I do think, and I have said this in some public forums and gotten a little bit of trouble for it, but I'm going to say it again. I do think that age actually plays a role in this as well. You know, all of us are the product of our personal experience. And if you take the case of Nicaragua, for example, Lula visited Managua back in either 80 or 81 at the invitation of Daniel Ortega in the full glory of the post-Sandinista revolution. And I learned this from an interview with Ortega's vice president during those early years in the 80s. Of course, now he's in exile outside Nicaragua, just like everybody else who was part of Ortega's early circle in those days. The former vice president said that it was actually Ortega who introduced Lula to Fidel. And that therefore, you know, the implication, I think he said this explicitly, I think it was an interview with El País, he said it's just impossible for Lula to criticize Ortega because they're part of that brotherhood that was, you know, did so many things together over time and thought of themselves as having a shared cause. And I would point out, you know, as Lula approaches the age of 80, and to be very clear, I'm not being ageist with this because some of the most modern names I know are modern minds I know are older people. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. But I do find it interesting that the one figure on the Latin American left, among the presidents anyway, who has been most critical of what's happening in Venezuela and Nicaragua is 37-year-old Gabriel Boric in Chile, because he doesn't have that baggage. He doesn't have that personal experience that makes him sympathetic to that. So I do, you know, it's funny. I mean, we can talk about isms and structures and kind of all these big forces that affect nations, and there, you know, that's a valid view as well. But sometimes we have to remember, even at the presidential level, that these are just people. And, you know, they're prone to some of the same blind spots. And I mean, maybe blind spots too kind of term for what Lula goes through on this issue, but that's what I think it is. Gosh, you know, just really quickly, I will try to do TV style sort of 30 seconds on each of these so others can speak. The points that Marcelo raised. the BRICS expansion that was agreed to in South Africa, I think it was last month, came as a surprise to the Brazilian delegation. And what I've heard was that it was kind of put to them as a take it or leave it kind of proposition. I think there's been a real, Brazil essentially said yes. But if you hear hail pounding the window of this, you know that sometimes in the tropics, a very hot day like today ends with a thunderstorm, and that's what's happening right now. So if you hear a strange noise, that's what it is. There's a realization now that this expansion has fundamentally changed the nature of BRICS. Having Iran in there in particular takes a group that really did make some sense in a geopolitical sense as a gathering of 5 large nations of the global south. Calling Russia global south is a bit of a stretch, but a lot of people think of it that way. It has now become something of really a alternate world order with China at the head of the table. And that makes some people uncomfortable. And then just, maybe leave the labor partnership to somebody else, because we don't know a lot of details on that. We just know that it's a source of kind of affection and warmth that has made both leaders, Biden and Lula, feel good. But that's one where we don't know a lot of practice. I'll tell a very short story about can Brazil harness this moment? Former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was president, speaking of people maybe not being old enough to remember, was president in the late 90s and early 2000s, once told me on this question. He said, I think we have to take advantage of Brazil's greatest strategic, or one of our greatest strategic assets, which is that Brazil is far. Brazil é longe. And he drew a parallel with what Brazil did during World War II, which was wait on the sidelines of this world that was dividing in two and trying to extract some sort of benefit for itself. And Brazil did. That's what Getulio Vargas did back in the 1940s, and Brazil got a steel industry out of it. It's true. If you go back and look, the seeds of the Brazilian steel industry came as part of the negotiation that Getulio did with the United States. And so I think there's a hope. Not everybody here thinks of it that way, but not just in Brazil. But again, this is another issue that's not particularly partisan. It's not ideological. All over the region, you find people who are, at least for now, hoping to strike some sort of balance between Washington and Beijing.
Wendy.
Okay. I just wanted to say the other thing that constrains Lula, making him sort of go out on these symbolic endorsements, is Lula's from a party. He still has party militants breathing down his neck. He can't just maneuver like a single unified actor. And, he's made all sorts of really unsavory political deals with right-wing politicians. And that's what he does to stay in power. So he's caught between these party militants and the deals you have to make to survive in Brazilian politics. So he really does need to show his leftist credentials somewhere. And the foreign policy front is probably the least constrained, is what Kurt said. Paloma, I'm looking at your question on who the political foreign policy team is. Brazil has a very well-trained diplomatic corps. And the last time Lula was in power, they had a lot of clashes because he went out and autonomously and made overtures that the professional diplomats didn't agree with. He even single-handedly tried to make a rule that Itamaraty diplomats don't have to speak English. You can imagine in a world where English is really the international language, that didn't last too long. I think given how much Bolsonaro ruffled the feathers of professional diplomats, they're probably glad to have Bolsonaro back in power. But no, there is Lula back in power. And with Celso Amorim, who is reasonable person, not the first exterior minister that Lula had in power.
Sure.
Well, one thing that I find very interesting about Lula's foreign policy, and that's a fairly wild claim, is, in some sense, during his first 2 runs as president and now, he really is in the continuity of Brazilian foreign policy in the long run. I mean, Brian just mentioned, Brazil's using the tension before the Second World War for its own benefit, that kind of pragmatic, very, you can say, opportunistic, not very principled foreign policy. I mean, that is something that has been a long-term continuity in Brazilian foreign policy, and it goes from, it's a style that presidents coming from the left and from the right, authoritarians or Democrats have done. The Brazilian military regime, for example, to the consternation of the US, very quickly recognized the left-wingers taking over in Angola and Mozambique for a very pragmatic reason, right? And so that is a long-standing tradition that Lula, in some sense, continues. So this is not only about Lula. This is, in some sense, a long-standing strand in Brazilian foreign policy that, from Washington's perspective, since Washington, whatever we make of it, tries to have a more principled foreign policy, it's just kind of grating for Washington. The other point I wanted to maybe call attention to is clearly when it's related to the point about BRICS. Why did you have this BRICS grouping? It wasn't only about countries that were important on their own, but kind of countries that claimed regional leadership, speaking for a region, not only Brazil, but kind of Brazil as the leader or representative of Latin America. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with Lula's renewed quest for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. He did that in his first government and didn't get very far, and he has renewed it recently. And my sense is that's just a non-starter in Latin America, because, there are other countries that regard themselves as important, like Argentina and Mexico and other countries. And so when Brazil has this claim of being like a rising global power, a lot of that is based on this implicit idea that Brazil, just look at the geographic weight the country has in South America, is the leader of South America. And I think that is a very questionable claim, because a lot of other Latin American countries don't want to take second seat to Brazil. They don't want to recognize Brazil's leadership in that kind of way. And so, if that is one of the basis, aspirational basis of sustenance for Brazil's foreign policy role, it's a fairly weak foundation. So,
I don't think that the aspiration comes from the size of the country toward Latin America, but the size of the country vis-a-vis in the world, and it precedes. I mean, when Brazil aspired that, Brazil was smaller than Argentina. Now Sao Paulo has for decades been bigger than Argentina. It's not the power, the size. It's an aspiration that precedes that. But I would like to ask also about putting Brazil in the context of the United States relationship with Latin America in general, because I think that what we have seen lately, and maybe Brian will correct me, is that we are in another of those times in history that Latin America means very little for the United States, and is not given even the teeth and the influence of the United States in Latin America. Talking about countries like Nicaragua or Guatemala or El Salvador is very low now because of migration and other problems. But Brazil enters in this area. I mean, although we are so big, we are still part of that. Do you agree that, Brian, of the low moment of the importance of Latin America towards the United States?
No, I con todo respeito, I don't think I actually agree. I mean, and look, this discussion of Brazil's relative power being less than it was a couple of years ago, I'm not sure that's true either. I mean, look, Brazil is the world's sixth largest country by population, and its fifth biggest by territory. And if they were to do the UN Security Council today, based on size and merit, Brazil would absolutely be on the Security Council. The issue, though, is that we live in an era where these great, we remain kind of stuck in amber of the global governance that we formed after World War II, a lot of which has served us really well, which I think is part of the hesitance to change it, but it is stuck. And look, Lula, it's funny, you hear different things when you talk to different people. I was in a left-leaning country, let's put it that way, back in 2022 during the election, and I was hearing people in the government there say that they were hoping that Lula would win, and then my interlocutor, who was a government official, fairly senior, kind of grabbed his head and said, but I guess if Lula does win, he's going to try to start bossing us around again. And I was just taken aback, but it's true. I mean, and it varies from country to country, because in Argentina, there's this, Lula is treated almost as a guru by the outgoing Alberto Fernandez government. Milei, who may win on Sunday, is called him a communist, which, maybe the truth is somewhere, in the middle there. But in other countries around the region, there is a feeling that Brazil sometimes takes its leadership role in the region for granted because of their size, and that they don't do the homework necessary of consulting some of the other governments to see what they think. They just kind of automatically assume that they're the big guy in the room, and and behavior that's strikingly similar to what the United States is accused of doing sometimes. But on the other hand, Lula really does have him personally just such a huge megaphone, partly because of his biography and his history on the global stage, but also because of Brazil's size. And at a moment where the global South is ascendant, and there's so much talk about the global South, the two most visible leaders are probably Modi and Lula. And so, there's a reason why Brazil is being cultivated by nations all over the world, including Beijing, including Moscow, including Washington. And I think we'll see that continue to accelerate over the next couple of years. So there's a lot of nuances. There always is on these strategic questions. But I'm a big believer that, and Rosental, you asked about Latin America as a whole. Several of the issues that touch most directly on Biden's reelection campaign pass through Latin America, starting not just with immigration, which is the one that comes to everybody's mind, but also issues like fentanyl, as well as sort of more like an agenda positiva in areas such as economic growth, nearshoring, all the things that can make the U.S. economy both stronger and more reliant or less reliant on Asia, and particularly China over time. So Washington doesn't always have the tools to make those relationships work as smoothly as they'd like to, in part because neither party in Washington believes in trade anymore. But I don't think that there's any view. I don't find any view that Latin America is less important than it used to be. Quite the contrary.
Wendy, you'd like to?
While we're talking about Brazil and neighboring countries, what really strikes me, I've been in Brazil for long times, much less time than you have, Brian, recently. But what always struck me is when you open up like Folha de São Paulo, there are lots of articles about domestic politics in Brazil. Then there's lots of articles about the United States, and there's barely anything about any other Latin American country. So is it still that way? And what does that tell us?
I think this one's for Rosental.
Well, I can tell you my time as a correspondent in Latin America for a Brazilian newspaper was from 1979 to the end of the 80s. So I saw a transformation in that time. For example, when I arrived in Argentina in 1979, Argentines knew nothing about us, and we, our back towards, and the Itamaraty had a policy that was very strong, very well established during the military regime about America do Sul, South America. We are not Latin America, we are South America, and I covered all the trips of the presidents of Brazil, the dictators going to the neighbor countries, and seeing that we were for the first time opening up. I mean, this absence that you see now there in the press in Brazil to cover neighbor countries, not enough. It was even worse in that time. We felt like our model is the United States. I mean, the previous generation was Europe, right? And we were just totally connected with that, and we did not feel Latin American. As I think it is much better now in that sense than it used to be, and there are much more business. So I saw the beginning of the Mercosur as an extraordinary movement. I mean, the nuclear agreement between Brazil and Argentina that nobody remembers anymore were a very important watershed that established a new kind of relationship that is now. But I do think that we are not in a moment that the United States is paying enough attention to Latin America. I will respectfully disagree with Brian. Maybe it's just a relative thing. I mean, compare with what, right? But when I see even the attention that they are paying to Central America, you know, the policy, what has been done in Central America, knowing, as you say very right, that you know, the migration is the obvious problems, and the vice president was designated to take care of this, and what came out of that?
I think they saved democracy in Guatemala.
Well, they have been.
You know, I mean, I wasn't. Just
I mean,
the
the jury's out there.
Well, but I wasn't just the U.S. But I mean, they every day they've been talking about this transition and saying it needs to be arevalo and so on. So we hear all the time. I hear all the time this lament that the U.S. isn't doing enough for the region, and I think there's truth to it. But I think there's also, you know, the question becomes, all right, what should they do? And people kind of tend to go, well, I don't know.
Think twice about what we wish, that because we have always been complaining about interventionism, etc. And now we're complaining, oh my God, they are not intervening. Kurt, why don't you say a few words?
So this is interesting about the importance of Latin America for the United States, because I completely agree with Brian that some of the issues that will be very decisive for the election campaign in the United States next year are Latin America based, but that affects only countries from the circum-Caribbean basin, you know, Central America, Mexico, essentially. South America really isn't that important. I mean, in terms of migration flows, except for Venezuela. So the circum-Caribbean basin, that is important in that respect. You know, whatever is south of like the equator, from this perspective.
If I may just interject, though, the single biggest group of people stopped at the border in September was Venezuelans for the first time ever. And
Circum-Caribbean.
Oh, I see.
Those countries border on the Caribbean. The second point is, in terms of Lula's position, I do think that he has less clout and importance, partly for the following reason. During his first 2 terms as president, you had the Pink Titan, you had Hugo Chavez, who was talking really, really loud and big. And Lula's role was partly to be the kind of moderate, reasonable left-winger who was neither left nor right, and who could kind of be built up to be a friendly container of Chavez in the typical Brazilian way, not like confront, but the big bear hug. Here, friend Chavez, you know, let me put you to my breast and make sure that you don't get too much out of control. Latin America now is in a very different position. The region is politically, ideologically very heterogeneous. It's a very confused time. There isn't a common trend. And so that makes it harder for Lula to have kind of a strategic position as the left winger who is part of the pink tide, but not kind of radical loudmouth like Chavez. And I think that is another thing that limits Lula's clout vis-a-vis the United States.
Yeah, that was precisely my original question about if Lula is more izquierdista now, because Lula was during the first 2 terms an alternative from the left. Lula was the moderate power with Chavez, and he would say things that were calming down and say, well, you know, with all this thing that I think Brian mentioned before, of we understand the camaraderie, etc. But he was clearly an alternative. When Funes was elected in El Salvador, that people said communism is coming, the guerrilla took over, etc. Suddenly we saw that he was more aligning with Lula than with Chavez, and so he exercised that role that you described so well. And I don't think now he is doing that. He is taking some positions that are very, very bold, and you go ahead, Brian.
Well, there is a data point that contradicts that a bit, which is that when they struck the deal between the Maduro dictatorship and the opposition in Barbados a couple of weeks ago,
yeah,
was some reporting that I've heard was true, that at the very last moment, the Maduro people started to walk away or balk or want to change the terms of it, and that it was actually Celso Amorim who leaned on the Maduro people who were there to accept the deal.
I don't think it contradicts, it confirms what I'm trying to say. He has this capacity of exercising, but you know, his discourse now has been different in that sense. But he still has the instinct of playing that role, and I think he can.
So my objection is that deal in Barbados isn't worth a thing. It's not worth
Oh,
it.
I mean, beyond the merits of the
So
deal
this is,
itself.
you know,
Yeah,
Maduro,
yeah.
oh yes, we will have free and fair elections, you know, and the primary of the opposition that Maria Corina Machado won in a lopsided thing. Well, of course, she's outlawed, so let's have clean and fair elections without the main opposition candidate. So if that was the success of Lula and Brazilian diplomacy, you know, so.
Yeah. So we have just 5 minutes more, and I wonder if there is any issue. For example, we have a question about the real impact of the environmental changes in Brazil, in the deforestation, etc., in the American Brazilian relationship. How big it is, and how convincing it is, and what can come out of that in the context of COP28 and all the global movements.
So I think what has happened is important and it's positive, but I would like to underscore Brazilian governors have a lot of power. Amazonian governors who are like decidedly in the pocket of agribusiness. And, you know, states like Roraima had like 70%, probably 80% around there support Bolsonaro. These governors have a lot of power due to Brazilian federalism. So while I think these changes are good, there's a whole second line that will limit them.
True. And Brian, in the beginning, Wendy talked about the narco trafficking and the militarization. How do you guys see that? Because it is really concerning. It keeps growing, and it's one of the most delicate areas now in Brazil.
Yeah, it's really scary, and you know, we see here. I've been in Sao Paulo for the last more than a week, writing a book actually about the city, a short history of the city. And in order to talk about the city today, you have to talk about the PCC, the Primeiro Comando do Capital, the biggest organized crime group in South America, certainly. And the government, the successive state governments, to Wendy's point about, you know, states really taking the lead on a lot of issues, including security, have chosen a policy of non-confrontation with the PCC. As a result, the murder rate in Sao Paulo is now well below most American cities. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 per 100,000, which I believe is actually less than the U.S. national average. On the other hand, it is a massive multi-billion-dollar, all-powerful crime syndicate that controls increasingly more of day-to-day life of the economy here, as well as the politics. And I think there's a real, you know, I've talked to some politicians, city politicians while I was here, as well as some national ones, who just don't know what to do. really don't. And so this move that Lula made, I think, is a realization that I think it points to things that we people out here don't even know about the reach of some of these organized crime groups, particularly the PCC, into really critical sectors of Brazilian power and life itself. And it echoes what we're seeing all over the region right now with groups like Tren de Aragua, the gang that originally had its roots in Venezuelan prisons, moving into places like Chile and Ecuador, where they didn't previously have many of these problems. You know, I 25 years of kind of living and traveling in this part of the world. You hope at some point you're going to see this trend diminish, but I've only seen organized crime become more powerful in the years that I've been doing this.
And just to end in a not pleasant note, the two last subjects, you know, the environmental issue, the Amazon, the governors that Wendy talked, are crossing with the organized crime, because the presence of the PCC and the presence of organized crime in the illegal activities of mining and lumbering, etc., in the Amazon region is very scary.
It's true, but to end on an optimistic note, which I know is a very Brazilian instinct on my part, I think it's safe to say, despite that, they have made tremendous progress on this issue this year. And to me, during Lula's first government as well as this one, to me, it's the most optimistic thing you can say about this government. It's, you know, on economic policy, it's not always great. On foreign policy, it's not always great. But it is a government that knows how to project power. And knows how to organize things and make progress in this area, and that's not only good for Brazil, that's good for the planet.
Yeah, and in terms of the planet in the agribusiness, also a good note is that after reading the book of João Moreira Salles about the Amazon, you know, and the productivity and all this thing, I mean, the agribusiness in Brazil has already destroyed more than enough to increase its production, and so it is possible to kind of control this horrible thing that happened, and still be a breadbasket of the world. Wow, I think this was great. I learned a lot. Thank you very, very much. Unless anybody has any last comment, I think we can finish, right, Paloma? We are finishing in time for Brian to go to the airport and come to Thanksgiving in the United States.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and what a privilege to be here with such fine Brazilianists and two actual Brazilians.
It's funny that people call me Brazilian. They say, I'm not Brazilian, I'm Brazilian. I'm subject of your study. Okay, so thank you so much, and I hope we can repeat that soon, okay?